The hum of the gravity vault filled Zara Khel'Vyn's ears as she stepped into the domed arena aboard the Eclipse Nexus station. The air buzzed with energy. Holographic projections flickered across the curved walls, casting shifting patterns of light over the metallic floor. Gravity plates pulsed beneath her boots, ready to twist and tilt at the AI's command. She adjusted her grip on the virus, her sleek energy blade, its faint blue glow humming softly in her hand. This was her domain, her battlefield. No one had ever bested her here, not in 100 matches across a dozen systems. Zara tilted her head, her long, pointed ears twitching as she scanned the arena. Her silver hair, pulled tight into a high braid, gleamed under the lights, and her violet eyes narrowed with focus. She was Valari, born of precision, forged in strategy. Her people didn't just fight. They calculated victory before the first blow landed. And today, she'd prove it again. Her opponent stepped into view on the opposite side of the ring, and Zara's lips pressed into a thin line. Mark Tanner, human, scruffy, and utterly unimpressive. He slouched against the wall, hands stuffed in the pockets of his patched-up flight jacket. His dark brown hair stuck out in messy tufts, and a lazy grin stretched across his face. He didn't even carry a proper weapon, just a pair of reinforced gloves strapped to his wrists. Zara's gaze flicked over him, assessing. Shorter than her by half a foot, maybe 6 feet tall at most. Lean but not bulky. No elegance, no discipline. Just a cocky smirk and a reputation for mouthing off. "You sure you're in the right place, human?" she called, her voice cool and sharp. The crowd, mostly off-duty pilots and station techs, chuckled from the hovering spectator platforms above. Mark pushed off the wall, rolling his shoulders. Pretty sure. Unless they moved, the beat the alien contest somewhere else. His green eyes sparkled with amusement, and Zara's ears twitched again. Annoying already. She didn't dignify his jab with a response. Instead, she raised the virus, its hum intensifying as she settled into her stance. Legs bent, weight balanced, every muscle coiled like a spring. The AI's voice echoed through the arena. "Combatants ready. Match begins in 3, 2, 1. A sharp tone sounded, and the fight was on. Zara moved first, a blur of precision. She lunged, the virus slicing through the air in a perfect arc aimed at Mark's shoulder. He stumbled back, barely dodging, his boots skidding on the slick floor. She pressed forward, her strikes a seamless dance, slash, pivot, thrust. Each move was calculated, her mind racing through probabilities. He'd block here, dodge there, tire himself out in 10 seconds flat. Victory was inevitable, but Mark didn't follow the script. He ducked under her next swing, flopping onto the floor like a drunkard tripping over his own feet. The crowd roared with laughter, and Zara's jaw tightened. Ridiculous. She spun, aiming a low sweep to knock him flat, but he rolled, awkwardly, stupidly, right on her blade. Before she could adjust, the gravity plates shifted, tilting the floor 10 degrees. Her boots slid just an inch, but it was enough. Mark sprang up behind her, faster than she'd expected. She twisted to counter, but he was already too close. His gloved hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her off balance, and in one chaotic motion, he hooked his leg behind hers. The world flipped. Zara hit the ground hard, her breath rushing out as his weight pinned her down. For a split second, everything stopped. His knee pressed in her arm, locking it against the cold floor. His face hovered inches above hers, sweat glistening on his brow, his chest heaving from the effort. His breath, hot and ragged, brushed against her ear, and a shiver shot through her. Her sensitive Valari ears twitched involuntarily, the sensation sharp and unfamiliar. "Gotcha," he murmured, his voice low, teasing. His lips curved into that infuriating grin, so close she could feel the warmth radiating off him. "You tense up, or you just like this part?" Heat flared in Zara's cheeks. She shoved him off with a snarl, rolling to her feet in one fluid motion. Her ears burned, and she turned away, hiding the flush creeping up her neck. The crowd erupted, cheers, hoots, applause, all for him. For him. A human. She clenched her fists, the virus humming louder in her grip. Lucky shot, she snapped, glaring over her shoulder. Mark dusted himself off, still grinning. Luck's a skill, sweetheart. You should try it sometime. The AI chimed in. Match concluded. Victory, Mark Tanner. Zara's stomach twisted. She stormed out of the arena, the roar of the crowd chasing her down the corridor. Her mind churned, replaying every second of the fight. How had he done it? She'd mapped his moves, predicted his weaknesses, slow reflexes, no formal training, no strategy. And yet, he turned her own momentum against her. It didn't make sense. In her quarters, Zara activated the holographic replay. The shimmering image of the gravity vault materialized, her silver form clashing with Mark's scruffy outline. She paused at mid-fight, studying his sloppy dodge. No logique, no pattern, just chaos. She scowled, tapping the console to zoom in. His grin taunted her even in the frozen frame. The door slid open, and Lieutenant Vex strolled in, another Valari, all sharp cheekbones and golden eyes. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his long ears flicking with amusement. Still obsessing over the human who flattened you. I am not obsessing, Zara said, her tone icy. I'm analyzing an anomaly. Vex smirked. Right, an anomaly that had you pinned to the floor, blushing like a cadet. I saw those ears twitch, Khel'Vyn. She shot him a glare that could have cut steel. It was a reflex, nothing more. Sure it was. He stepped closer, peering at the hologram. He's messy, I'll give you that. But he made you sweat in ways I haven't seen before. Combat-wise, I mean. His grin widened. Or maybe not. Zara swiped the hologram off with a sharp gesture. If you're here to mock me, leave. Not mocking. Observing. Vex tilted his head. You've signed up for a rematch already, haven't you? She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Vex chuckled and sauntered out, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She reactivated the hologram, staring at Mark's image. His hands on her wrist, his breath on her ear. It replayed her mind, unbidden. She shook her head, banishing the thought. This wasn't about whatever that was. It was about winning, proving Valari superiority. She'd beat him next time. She had to. Later that cycle, Zara found Mark in the station's cantina, sprawled across a bench with a drink in hand. He spotted her and waved lazily. Hey, Sean, come to congratulate me. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. I've scheduled a rematch. Tomorrow, Gravity Vault. Be there. His grin widened, and he sat up, leaning forward. Can't wait to get close to me again. Her ears twitched before she could stop them, and she cursed inwardly. To defeat you, she corrected, voice tight. Whatever you say. He stood, stretching, his jacket riding up to reveal a sliver of toned muscle beneath. Zara's eyes flicked to it, then away, her pulse quickening for no reason she'd admit. See you there, Zara. Bring your A-game. And maybe a smile. She turned on her heel and left, his laughter echoing behind her. Back in her quarters, she paced, the memory of his touch lingering like a ghost on her skin. It wasn't attraction, not possible. It was irritation, a challenge. She'd crush him tomorrow, wipe that smirk off his face. But as she lay down to rest, her mind wouldn't settle. She saw his eyes, bright and daring, felt the heat of his breath again. Her ears twitched once more, and she groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. Sleep came slowly, tangled with thoughts of chaos she couldn't calculate, and a human she couldn't forget. Zara stood before the holographic console in her quarters, the dim glow casting sharp shadows across her angular features. Her long ears twitched as she replayed the fight with Mark Tanner for the 10th time that cycle. The shimmering projection looped endlessly, her virus slashing through the air, Mark's clumsy dodge, the moment he'd flipped her onto the gravity vault's floor. She froze the image just as his knee pinned her arm, his face hovering above hers. That grin, that damn grin. Her fingers tightened around the console's edge, the metal creaking faintly under her grip. How had she lost? Every move she'd made was flawless. Angles precise, timing impeccable. She'd accounted for his slower human reflexes, his lack of training. Yet he'd turn it all against her with that absurd roll, that reckless tug. It defied logic. It defied her. The door hissed open, and Zara didn't need to turn to know who it was. Vex's voice slithered into the room, smooth and mocking. "Still dissecting your little tumble with a human?" "I'm identifying a flaw," she said, her tone clipped. She swiped the hologram off, the image of Mark vanishing into a flicker of light. Vex stepped inside, his golden eyes glinting with amusement. He was Valari like her, tall, lean, with the same elongated ears and sharp cheekbones. But where Zara radiated control, Vex oozed casual insolence. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "A flaw in him, or in you, because from where I stood, he had you pinned like a training drone." Her ears flicked, a sharp twitch she couldn't suppress. It was an anomaly, a statistical outlier. It won't happen again, right? Vex's smirk widened. An anomaly that made your ears dance like a lovesick cadet's. "I saw it, Zara. Everyone did." Heat crept up her neck, and she spun to face him, violet eyes blazing. It was a reflex, a physiological response to proximity. Nothing more. Sure it was. He tilted his head, studying her. "You've scheduled a rematch already, haven't you?" "Can't resist getting close to him again." She didn't answer, but her silence betrayed her. Vex chuckled, low and knowing, then pushed off the wall. "Just don't trip over your own pride this time, Khel'Vyn. Humans are slippery." He sauntered out, leaving her alone with the echo of his words. Zara exhaled sharply, her breath fogging the air. She wasn't obsessed. She wasn't flustered. She was a Valari strategist, and Martaner was a puzzle, a glitch in her perfect system. Tomorrow, she'd solve him, crush him, prove that chaos couldn't outmatch calculation. The next cycle, the gravity vault buzzed with anticipation. The crowd was bigger now, drawn by rumors of the human who'd toppled a Valari champion. Zara stepped onto the platform, her black combat suit hugging her frame, the virus glowing faintly at her side. Her ears twitched as she scanned the arena, the gravity plates humming beneath her boots. She'd prepared for this, analyzed every second of their last fight. This time, she'd anticipate his tricks. Mark swaggered in moments later, his jacket slung over one shoulder, gloves dangling from his belt. He flashed that infuriating grin, green eyes locking onto hers. "Back for more, huh? Couldn't stay away." "To defeat you," she said, her voice steel. "Your luck ends today." "Luck's just chaos with better PR," he replied, slipping on his gloves. "Let's dance, Zara." The AI's countdown rang out, and the match began. Zara struck first, faster this time, her virus a blur of blue energy. She aimed for his legs, forcing him to move. He dodged, sloppy, predictable, and she pivoted, slashing upward. He stumbled back, barely avoiding the blade, and she pressed her advantage. Her mind raced, calculating his next step. He'd roll again, or lunge, or... The gravity shifted. The floor tilted 15 degrees, and Zara adjusted instantly, her boots gripping the surface. Mark, though, slid, then grabbed the wall, using the momentum to swing around her. She spun to counter, but he was already midair, diving low. His shoulder clipped her thigh, and she staggered, catching herself just as he rolled to his feet behind her. "Too slow," he called, grinning. She gritted her teeth and lunged, her strikes sharper now, relentless. The virus hummed with each swing, carving arcs of light through the air. Mark ducked and weaved, his movements a mess of improvisation, dodging one blow, tripping over his own feet to avoid the next. The crowd cheered, loving his antics, but Zara stayed focused. She saw it now. He relied on the arena's chaos, the shifting plates, the unpredictable angles. Fine. She'd use it too. She feinted left, then kicked off a gravity plate as it tilted, launching herself high. Mark's eyes widened, and he dove to the side, but she'd anticipated that. She landed hard, her blade aimed at his chest. Victory was hers. Until it wasn't. Mark twisted at the last second, grabbing her ankle mid-fall. The sudden pull threw her off balance. and the floor rushed up to meet her. She hit with a grunt, the virus skittering from her hand. Before she could recover, his weight crashed onto her again, this time chest to chest, his hands pinning her wrists above her head. The arena went silent, then exploded into cheers. Zara's breath caught, her heart pounding against her ribs. His face was inches from hers, sweat dripping from his brow onto her cheek. His breath, hot, uneven, brushed her lips, and her ears twitched wildly, the sensation shooting through her like a current. His body pressed against hers, firm and unyielding, and for a fleeting moment, she felt every line of him, his chest rising and falling, his thighs bracing hers to the floor. Déjà vu. Huh? He murmured, his voice a low rumble. His grin softened, but his eyes burned into hers, bright and daring. You're gorgeous when you're mad. You know that? Her face flushed, a wildfire she couldn't control. She shoved him off with a surge of strength, rolling to her knees as he sprawled back, laughing. Cheater, she hissed, snatching up her virus. Adaptation, not cheating, he said, standing. He wiped his brow, his jacket slipping to reveal the taut muscles of his arm. You're getting predictable, Zara. All that fancy math can't keep up with me. The AI chimed. Match concluded. Victory, Mark Tanner. The crowd roared, and Zara's ears flattened against her head. She stormed out, her pulse racing, not just from the fight, but from the memory of his weight, his words, his damned breath on her skin. Back in her quarters, she slammed her fist against the console, the hologram flickering to life. She replayed the match, pausing at the moment he'd pinned her. His hands on her wrists, his body flush against hers. It wasn't just the defeat that stung. It was something else, something she refused to name. Vex appeared again, uninvited as always. 2 losses in a row. That's a record for you. He leaned in, peering at the hologram. And look at that. He's got you blushing again. I'm not blushing, she snapped, shutting off the display. It's exertion. Uh-huh. Vex's grin was insufferable. Exertion that's got your ears twitching like signal flags. You like him, don't you? Absurd, she said, but her voice faltered just for a heartbeat. He's a menace. An illogical, reckless. Winner, Vex finished. Twice now. Maybe it's time to stop overthinking and start fighting back his way. She glared at him, but his words lingered after he left. Overthinking. Was that her flaw? She'd built her life on strategy, on certainty. Mark was the opposite, chaos incarnate. And he kept winning. That evening, she tracked him down in the cantina again. He sat alone, nursing a drink, his jacket slung over the bench. He looked up as she approached, his grin returning. 3 times in one day. I'm flattered, Zara. I need to understand, she said, stopping a foot away. How do you do it? How do you win without a plan? He leaned back, stretching his arms along the bench. His shirt clung to his chest, damp from the day's fights, and her eyes flicked to it before she forced them back to his face. Easy, he said. I don't think. I just move. Feel the fight, not map it. That's nonsense, she said, crossing her arms. Combat is science, not instinct. Maybe for you. He stood, stepping closer, too close. She caught a whiff of him, sweat, metal, something faintly earthy, and her ears twitched again. But humans? We thrive in the mess. You should try it. Loosen up a little. I don't loosen up, she said, her voice tight. He chuckled, his breath brushing her cheek as he leaned in. You will. Next match, I'll make you. He winked and walked off, leaving her standing there, her heart thudding traitorously in her chest. Back in her quarters, Zara paced, her mind a storm. She hated him, his arrogance, his unpredictability, his stupid grin. But as she replayed the fight in her head, it wasn't just the loss that haunted her. It was the feel of him, his hands, his heat, his voice. She groaned, burying her face in her hands. This wasn't about him. It was about winning. She'd figure him out. She had to. But as sleep claimed her, her dreams betrayed her. Flashes of green eyes, a low laugh, and the weight of a human she couldn't shake. Zara stood in the dim glow of her quarters, the holographic console humming softly as she stared at the frozen image of her second defeat. Mark's hands pinned her wrists, his sweat-streaked face hovering above hers, that grin mocking her even in stillness. Her long ears twitched, a restless tick she couldn't suppress. 2 losses. 2 humiliating falls to a human who fought like a malfunctioning drone. Sloppy, reckless, and somehow unstoppable. She swiped the hologram off, the light fading into shadow. Enough analyzing. She needed answers, and replaying her shame wouldn't give them to her. His words from the cantina echoed in her mind. Feel the fight, not map it. Nonsense. Combat was a science. Angles, timing, probabilities. Instinct was for animals, not warriors. Yet science had failed her twice now. She gritted her teeth, her violet eyes narrowing. Fine. If she couldn't beat him with logic alone, she'd study his chaos up close. Dissect it, master it, then destroy him with it. The next cycle, Zara tracked Mark to the station's lower training deck, a quieter space, away from the Gravity Vault's crowds. The private combat hall was small, its walls lined with dented panels and flickering hollow barriers. Mark was already there, sprawled on a mat, stretching with the casual laziness of someone who didn't take anything seriously. His jacket lay discarded nearby, his shirt clinging to his frame, damp from a prior workout. He looked up as she entered, his green eyes lighting with that infuriating spark. "Third time this week," he said, sitting up. "You stalking me now, Zara?" "I'm here to train," she said, her voice clipped. She set the virus against the wall, opting for hand-to-hand today. No weapons, just her and him. "You claim your method works. Prove it." He grinned, standing with a slow roll of his shoulders. "You want a lesson in chaos? Careful what you wish for." She crossed her arms, her combat suit sleek and black against her silver hair. "Not a lesson, a demonstration. I'll spar with you. No rules, no audience. Show me how you fight." Mark tilted his head, studying her. "No rules, huh? Sounds dangerous with you." His tone was teasing, but his eyes flicked over her, quick, subtle, taking in the way her suit hugged her curves. Her ears twitched, catching the shift in his gaze, and heat prickled her neck. She ignored it. "Begin," she said, settling into her stance, knees bent, fists raised, every muscle coiled with precision. He didn't bother with his stance, just bounced lightly on his toes. "All right, let's see what you've got." Zara struck first, a sharp jab aimed at his chest. He sidestepped, barely, then ducked as she followed with a sweeping kick. Her moves were textbook Valari. Fast, clean, lethal. She aimed for his shoulder, his ribs, his knee, each strike a calculated step toward control. But Mark didn't fight back like she expected. He dodged with a stumble, flailed an arm to block, then, absurdly, dropped to the floor and rolled under her next punch. She spun, exasperated. What was that? He popped up behind her, grinning. Being unpredictable. Worked, didn't it? Her ears flattened. "It's ridiculous. You look like you're malfunctioning." "But you missed," he said, shrugging. "Try again." Less thinking, more moving. She lunged, faster this time, aiming a flurry of strikes at his torso. He weaved through them, clumsy but effective, then caught her wrist mid-punch. She twisted free, but he was already shifting, hooking his leg behind hers. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her breath hitching. He stepped closer, too close, his chest brushing hers for a heartbeat before she shoved him back. "Stop planning," he said, his voice low. "You're telegraphing every move. I can see it in your eyes." "My eyes," she snapped, circling him. "You're guessing." "Nope. Feeling." He darted in, feinting left, then swung right. She blocked, but his momentum carried him forward, and their forearms collided, locking them in place. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm against her cheek. Her ears twitched wildly, and she felt the heat of him, his skin, his pulse, his sheer presence. "Feel that?" he murmured, his grin softening. "That's the fight talking. Listen to it." She pulled back, her face flushing. "I don't need lectures from you. Suit yourself." He stepped away, raising his hands. Again, they sparred for hours, the hall echoing with the thud of boots and the rustle of fabric. Zara kept her precision at first, but Mark's chaos wore her down. He'd dodge at impossible angles, trip over nothing, then somehow turn it into an attack. She landed a few hits, a solid punch to his shoulder, a kick grazing his thigh, but he always slipped away, grinning like it was a game. Finally, she snapped. He ducked her latest strike, and instead of countering with logic, she threw a wild, unscripted kick, pure instinct, no plan. It caught him off guard, slamming into his side. He grunted, stumbling back, then laughed, clutching his ribs. Okay, he said, raising a hand. That's more like it. Zara froze, her chest heaving. She'd hit him, not with strategy, but with whatever that was. Her ears twitched, and she straightened, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. You left an opening. Nah, he said, still grinning. You stopped thinking. That's the trick. She stared at him, her mind racing. It had worked. One hit didn't mean she'd mastered his madness, but it was something. A crack in her perfect system. She needed more. Tomorrow, she said, grabbing the virus. Same time. We do this again. Mark flopped onto the mat, stretching out with a groan. You're relentless, you know that? Fine. I'm in. Over the next few cycles, the private sparring became routine. Zara arrived each time with a plan, to observe, to adapt, but Mark dismantled it every session. He'd talk as they fought, tossing out quips that grated on her nerves. Loosen those shoulders, Zara. Stop glaring, it's distracting. You smell like Starwind, you know, sharp and wild. That last one made her falter, her ears burning as she shoved him away. One evening, he showed up with 2 steaming cups, handing her one as they rested on the mat. Human coffee, he said. Try it. She sniffed it, wrinkling her nose. It smells like burnt circuits. Tastes better than it smells, he said, taking a sip. Come on, live a little. She hesitated, then sipped. It was bitter, harsh, but oddly warm. She frowned. Adequate. High praise, he said, laughing. He leaned back on his elbows, his shirt riding up slightly, exposing a strip of toned stomach. Her eyes flicked to it, then away, her pulse quickening. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. Why do you fight like this? She asked, setting the cup down. No structure, no discipline. It's inefficient. He shrugged. Humans don't have your fancy tech or perfect reflexes. We make do. Chaos is our edge, keeps us alive when the odds suck. She tilted her head, considering. And it works. Beat you twice, didn't it? He grinned, then softened. But you're getting it. That kick the other day? Pure instinct. You got in you, Zara. Just gotta let it out. Her ears twitched, and she looked away, the coffee's warmth lingering in her hands. He was right. Infuriatingly so. She'd felt it, that split-second freedom when she'd stopped calculating. But it still clashed with everything she'd trained for. Their next sparring session pushed her further. Mark upped the pace, weaving through her strikes with that maddening agility. She countered with precision, but he kept slipping past her defenses. Then it happened. He lunged, she dodged, and he tripped, crashing into her. They hit the mat together, a tangle of limbs, his weight pinning her down. For a moment, neither moved. His chest pressed against hers, his breath ragged in her ear. Her ears twitched, the sensation sharp and electric. His hand rested on her waist, accidental but firm, and she felt the heat of it through her suit. His face hovered above hers, his eyes wide, then softening. Sorry, he said, his voice husky. Bad landing. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her face burning. Get off, she managed, shoving him aside. He rolled away, laughing, but she caught the flush on his cheeks as he stood. Guess I'm the one slipping now, he said, rubbing his neck. You okay? I'm fine, she snapped, standing. Her waist tingled where his hand had been, and she turned away, hiding the confusion swirling in her chest. He didn't push it, just grabbed his jacket. Same time tomorrow? Yes, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He left, and she sank onto the mat, her breath uneven. She wasn't fine, not entirely. That moment, his touch, his closeness, had thrown her more than any fight. She hated it, hated him, and yet, the next day, she arrived early, determined to focus. No distractions, just training. Mark showed up with his usual grin, but there was a new edge to him, something sharper, more deliberate. They sparred harder, faster, and Zara let herself go. She stopped planning every move, let her body react. She landed a punch to his chest, a kick to his shin, and finally, after an hour of grueling back and forth, she caught him with a wild uppercut. He staggered back, laughing through a wince. "Damn, Zara, you're a natural." She stood there, panting, her fist still raised. A natural. A chaos. The thought should have repulsed her, but it didn't. It thrilled her. Her ears twitched, and she lowered her hands, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You're a terrible influence." "Best kind," he said, winking. He flopped onto the mat, patting the spot beside him. "Take a break. You've earned it." She hesitated, then sat, keeping a careful distance. He handed her the coffee again, and this time she drank without complaint. They sat in silence, the hum of the hall wrapping around them. Her mind churned, strategy clashing with instinct, logic warring with something new, something human. "You're not just a fighter," she said finally, glancing at him. "You're a puzzle." He chuckled, leaning closer. "And you're solving me, piece by piece. How's it feel?" Her ears twitched, his breath brushing her cheek. "Frustrating," she admitted. "And intriguing." His grin softened, his eyes holding hers. "Good. Keeps things fun." She looked away, her pulse racing. Fun. That wasn't the word she'd use. Dangerous, maybe. Addictive, possibly. But as she sat there, coffee warming her hands, she knew one thing. She wasn't done with Mark Tanner. Not yet. Zara Khel'Vyn stood alone in the private combat hall, the silence pressing against her ears like a living thing. Her long, pointed ears twitched faintly, catching the distant hum of the Eclipse Nexus station beyond the dented walls. The dim light cast shadows across the floor, flickering over the mat where she'd sparred with Mark Tanner countless times. Her boots tapped a steady rhythm as she paced, the sound sharp and deliberate, a counterpoint to the chaos swirling in her mind. The virus rested against the wall, its faint blue glow pulsing softly, like a heartbeat she could feel in her bones. She stopped, staring at it, her silver braid swaying behind her. 2 cycles ago, she'd landed that uppercut. The memory burned bright, her fist connecting with Mark's jaw, the jolt of it racing up her arm, the raw surge of instinct breaking through her Valari discipline. His laugh had followed, rough and unguarded, his green eyes glinting as he'd clutched his face and said, "You're a natural." The words had burrowed into her, refusing to fade. A natural? At what? Chaos? The thought should have repulsed her. Valari didn't thrive on disorder. They mastered it, shaped it, bent it to their will. "I'm ready to win," she corrected, lifting her chin. Her ears twitched again as he stopped a foot away, his presence pressing against her senses. She could feel the warmth radiating off him, the subtle shift in the air as he breathed. Her neck prickled, a flush she refused to acknowledge creeping upward. This wasn't about him. Not his grin, not his voice, not the way his body moved with that reckless grace. It was about her, her growth, her triumph. She'd spent cycles sparring with him, studying him, losing to him, and now she stood on the edge of something new. She wouldn't falter. He tilted his head, studying her with a gaze that lingered too long. Quick, subtle, tracing the lines of her combat suit. The black fabric hugged her frame, accentuating the sharp curves of her hips, the strength in her arms, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. Her ears twitched harder, a reflex she couldn't suppress, and heat bloomed in her cheeks. She turned away, hiding it, her braid swinging as she moved to the console on the wall. "Chaos Sphere," she repeated, her voice tighter than she meant. "Tomorrow, 0900 hours. Be there." "All right," he said, his tone softening, losing some of its tease. He stepped closer again, too close, and she caught the faint rustle of his shirt, the creak of his gloves as he flexed his hands. "Bring your best, Zara. I'll be waiting." His breath brushed her ear as he spoke, a fleeting warmth that made her ears twitch wildly, and she stiffened, her pulse jumping. He didn't notice, or pretended not to, and turned to leave, his boots echoing down the corridor. "Leave," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it, sharper than intended. He chuckled, low and warm, the sound lingering as the door slid shut. "See you there, champ." Zara exhaled, her breath shaky, and sank onto the mat, her hands resting on her knees. The hall was silent again, but her mind roared. Tomorrow, one match to prove she could wield chaos, not just survive it. Her pulse quickened, not from nerves, she told herself, but from the stakes. She'd faced him in the gravity vault, lost him twice, sparred with him in this very hall until her muscles ached and her pride bled. Each time, he'd pushed her, taunted her, unraveled her, forced her to rethink everything she'd built her life on. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes. The first fight flashed through her, his weight pinning her, his breath on her ear, the crowd's cheers drowning her shame. The second, his hands on her wrists, his body pressed against hers, his voice whispering, "You're gorgeous when you're mad." She'd shoved him off both times, her face burning, her ears twitching like traitors. Then the sparring, hours of him dodging, tripping, laughing, his hand brushing her waist once, his chest colliding with hers another time. Each moment had chipped away at her, not just her strategy, but her certainty. Her ears twitched again, and she groaned, rubbing her temples. She wasn't obsessed. She wasn't flustered. She was Valari, logic incarnate, a warrior of precision. Mark Tanner was a glitch, a puzzle, a human who'd stumbled into her world and turned it upside down. Tomorrow, she'd solve him, crush him, prove that chaos could be tamed, that she could wield it as deftly as her virus. Sleep eluded her that night. Her quarters were dark, the station's hum a faint backdrop to her restless thoughts. She saw every sparring session, every dodge, every hit. His chaos wasn't random. It was alive, adaptive, a rhythm she'd started to feel in her bones. She rose before dawn, the silence heavy, and slipped into her combat suit. The black fabric molded to her body, cool against her skin, and she strapped the virus to her side. Its weight steadied her, a tether to the strategist she'd always been. But today, she'd be more. More than Valari, more than logic, more than the woman who'd lost to him twice. She arrived at the chaos sphere as the station's lights flickered to life, the massive dome looming ahead like a beast waking from slumber. Its walls shimmered with shifting panels, drones hovering in the shadows, their red lights glinting like eyes. A small crowd had gathered, techs, pilots, even Vex lounging against a railing with his usual smirk, but Zara's focus narrowed to the platform. Mark was already there, stretching with that lazy ease, his jacket discarded, his gloves snug on his hands. His shirt clung to his chest, damp from a warm-up, and his grin flashed as he spotted her. "Nice turnout," he called, his voice carrying over the hum. "Guess they heard you're finally going to beat me." "They heard wrong," she said, stepping onto the platform. Her lips twitched into a faint smirk, a spark of defiance she hadn't felt before. "I will beat you." He laughed, and the sound stirred something in her chest, something she shoved down hard. The AI's voice cut through the noise. "Combatants ready. Chaos sphere activated. Match begins in 3, 2, 1. A sharp tone sounded, and the arena roared to life. Zara lunged the moment the chaos sphere's starting tone pierced the air, her virus flashing like a streak of blue lightning in her hand. The floor pulsed beneath her boots, gravity plates groaning as they shifted unpredictably. Mark dodged her first strike, his boots skidding across the tilting surface with that familiar, reckless grace. Above them, the drones whirred to life, their red lights locking onto both combatants like hungry eyes. She swung again, a precise arc aimed at his shoulder, but he dropped low, rolling under the blade with the maddening agility she'd come to expect. Weeks of sparring had sharpened her instincts. She pivoted instantly, kicking out, and caught his arm as he rose, forcing him back a step. "Not bad," he shouted, his grin flashing through a wince. The gravity shifted hard, pulling them sideways, and Zara adjusted without hesitation, her boots gripping the slick surface. Mark stumbled, his balance faltering for a split second, but he grabbed a rising panel with one hand, using the momentum to swing around her in a wild arc. She spun to counter, her braid whipping behind her, but he was already midair, diving low. His shoulder clipped her thigh, a glancing blow that sent her staggering. She caught herself just as he rolled to his feet behind her, his laughter ringing out over the crowd's cheers. "Too slow," he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. Zara gritted her teeth, her violet eyes narrowing. She lunged again, her strike sharper now, relentless. The virus hummed with each swing, carving arcs of blue light through the air, a dance of precision she'd honed over years. Mark ducked and weaved, his movements a mess of improvisation, dodging one blow with a clumsy sidestep, tripping over his own feet to avoid the next. The crowd roared, loving his antics, but Zara stayed focused, her mind racing. She saw it now. He thrived on the arena's unpredictability, the shifting plates, the sudden angles. Fine. She'd use it too. She feinted left, then kicked off a gravity plate as it tilted upward, launching herself high above him. Mark's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking through his grin, and he dove to the side. But she'd anticipated that. She landed hard, her boots slamming into the floor, the virus aimed at his chest in a thrust that should have ended it. Victory was hers, until it wasn't. Mark twisted at the last second, his gloved hand snagging her ankle mid-fall. The sudden pull threw her off balance, and the floor rushed up to meet her. She hit it with a grunt, her breath rushing out as the virus skittered from her grip, clattering across the platform. Before she could recover, his weight crashed onto her, chest to chest, his hands pinning her wrists above her head. The crowd gasped, then erupted into cheers, but Zara barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart. His face hovered inches from hers, sweat dripping from his brow onto her cheek. His breath, hot, uneven, brushed her lips, and her long ears twitched wildly, the sensation sharp and dizzying. His body pressed against hers, firm and unyielding through his damp shirt, and she felt every line of him, his chest heaving against hers, his thighs bracing her hips to the floor. His green eyes burned into hers, fierce and unguarded, and his grin faltered for a heartbeat, replaced by something raw, something that made her pulse spike. "Got you," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. Her face flushed, a wildfire she couldn't control, and heat surged through her, not just from the fight, but from him, his closeness, his damnable presence. "Not yet," she hissed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. She twisted hard, using his grip against him, and broke free, rolling to her knees as he sprawled back. He laughed, a rough, breathless sound, and she snatched the virus just as a drone fired, its stunned pulse streaking past her ear with a crackle of heat. Mark was up in an instant, still grinning, and charged her again. She met him head-on, their bodies colliding in a flurry of strikes and counters. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers strong and warm, but she twisted free, her elbow snapping toward his jaw. He ducked, his breath grazing her neck as he moved, and she blocked his punch, their forearms slamming together with a jolt. It was chaos, beautiful, maddening chaos, and Zara was in it, not just chasing it, but dancing with it. The drones fired relentlessly, their pulses zipping through the air, and the floor tilted and shifted beneath them. But she moved with it, her instincts sharp, her mind quieter than it had ever been in a fight. She saw an opening, his stance too wide after a dodge, his guard dropping for a split second, and lunged, the virus slashing upward in a wild, unscripted arc. He dodged, barely, his shirt tearing at the shoulder as the blade grazed him, and he countered fast, hooking her arm with his own. He pulled her close, too close, their bodies locking together in the heat of the struggle. Her chest pressed against his, the virus pinned between them, its hum vibrating through her ribs. His breath hit her lips again, fast and ragged, and her ears twitched, a shiver racing down her spine. His hand slid to her waist, gripping her to steady them as the floor tilted sharply, and she felt the strength in his fingers, the heat seeping through her suit. For a heartbeat, they were frozen there, his eyes locked on hers, bright and daring, his grin softening into something else. "You're good," he murmured, his voice husky, barely audible over the drones. Her pulse raced, her face burning, but she didn't pull away. Not yet. The crowd's cheers faded, the chaos of the arena blurring into the background. It was just them, his breath, his grip, the electric tension humming between them. She smirked, her voice low. "I'm better." With a sudden twist, she broke his hold, shoving him back with a surge of strength. He stumbled, and she dropped low, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the floor with a thud, and she pounced, her knees slamming into his chest, the virus flashing to his throat. The drones powered down, their lights dimming, and the AI's voice rang out. Match concluded. Victory, Zara Khel'Vyn. The crowd exploded, but Zara's world narrowed to the man beneath her, his chest rising and falling under her knee, his grin returning, slow, warm, almost proud. Zara held the virus steady at Mark's throat, her knee pressed into his chest, pinning him to the Chaos Sphere's floor. The drones had powered down, their red lights fading into the shadows, and the arena fell silent for a heartbeat before the AI's voice rang out. Match concluded. Victory, Zara Khel'Vyn. The crowd erupted, cheers, shouts, applause crashing over her like a wave, but Zara barely heard it. Her world narrowed to the man beneath her, his chest heaving under her weight, his damp shirt clinging to his skin. His green eyes locked onto hers, bright and fierce, and his grin returned, slow, warm, almost proud. "Well, damn," he said, his voice hoarse from exertion. "You did it." She blinked, her breath still ragged, then let a smirk tug at her lips. She eased the virus back, its hum softening. "I adapted," she said, her tone steady despite the adrenaline pulsing through her. "More than that," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You owned it." The words hit her harder than she expected, stirring something deep in her chest. She stood, offering a hand, and he took it, letting her pull him up. Their fingers lingered, his rough and warm, hers steady and cool, and her ears twitched, a reflex she couldn't hide as the heat of his palm pressed into hers. He noticed, his grin softening into something quieter, but he didn't tease her this time. The crowd surged forward, voices overlapping, but Zara's focus stayed on him, his torn sleeve, his sweat-streaked face, the way he stood close without crowding her. Vex pushed through the throng, his golden eyes glinting with amusement. "Finally," he said, clapping her shoulder hard enough to make her brace. "Thought you'd let him pin you again and call a day." "Shut up," she snapped, but there was no venom in it, just exhaustion and a flicker of pride. She glanced at Mark, who was brushing off his sleeve, still catching his breath. He caught her eye and winked, and her stomach flipped, traitorous, foolish, but undeniable. Later, in the quiet of the private combat hall, Zara sat alone on the mat, the virus beside her. Its hum was a soft echo of her triumph, a sound she could feel in her bones. She'd won, not with pure strategy, not with pure chaos, but with both, a fusion she hadn't known she could wield until today. She'd beaten him, yes, but more than that, she'd changed. The door slid open, and Mark stepped in, 2 steaming cups in his hands. "Coffee," he said, tossing one her way with that easy grin. She caught it, the warmth seeping into her fingers, and he sat beside her, closer than usual, his shoulder brushing hers. Her ears twitched, and she sipped the bitter drink to hide it, the taste sharp but familiar now. "So," he said, leaning back on his hands, his arm resting lightly against hers. "What's the verdict? Chaos worth it?" She glanced at him, his profile sharp in the dim light, his hair a mess, his grin faint but genuine. "It's effective," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "Combined with structure, it's formidable. High praise from you," he said, chuckling. The sound was warm, and she didn't pull away from the contact, casual, steady, stirring her pulse in a way she wouldn't name. You push me too, you know. Had to dig deep to keep up. You forced me to rethink everything, she said, meeting his eyes. I thank you. His grin softened, and he leaned closer, his breath brushing her cheek. Anytime, Zara, you're fun when you let loose. Her ears twitched, heat creeping up her face, and she shot him a look. I don't let loose. Uh-huh, he murmured, his voice low, teasing. Keep telling yourself that. She turned away, sipping the coffee, but a smirk lingered on her lips. He was insufferable, reckless, smug, impossible. And yet, as they sat there, the hum of the hall wrapping around them, she knew she wasn't done with Mark Tanner. Not yet. Zara Khel'Vyn sat on the mat in the private combat hall, the virus resting beside her, its faint blue glow casting a soft light across the dented floor. The chaos sphere match still echoed in her mind. The hum of the drones, the tilt of the gravity plates, the moment she'd pinned Mark beneath her knee. Her long ears twitched faintly, a lingering reflex from the adrenaline, the triumph, and something else she couldn't quite name. She'd won. Not just a fight, but something deeper, a shift in herself she hadn't seen coming. The door slid open, and Mark Tanner stepped in, his boots scuffing the floor with that familiar, careless rhythm. He carried 2 steaming cups, his grin flashing as he tossed one her way. Coffee, he said, his voice warm. Figured you'd need it after kicking my ass. She caught the cup, the warmth seeping into her fingers, and smirked faintly. You survived. That's something. Barely, he said, dropping onto the mat beside her. He sat closer than usual, his shoulder brushing hers, and she didn't pull away. His jacket was off, his shirt still torn at the sleeve from the fight, revealing the lean muscle of his arm. Her ears twitched, catching the faint scent of him, sweat, metal, coffee, and she sipped the bitter drink to steady herself. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the hall wrapping around them like a cocoon. The coffee was sharp on her tongue, a human habit she'd grown to tolerate, maybe even like. She glanced at him, his profile sharp in the dim light, his dark hair a mess, his green eyes glinting with that quiet spark she'd come to know. He wasn't just a fighter anymore, not just a puzzle she'd solved. He was something else. So, he said, breaking the quiet. He leaned back on his hands, his arm resting lightly against hers, a casual touch that sent a faint ripple through her. What's the verdict? Chaos worth it? Zara turned the question over in her mind, her violet eyes narrowing as she studied the cup in her hands. She thought of the gravity vault, her first loss, the way his breath had brushed her ear and unraveled her composure. She thought of the sparring, his quips and dodges, the moment his hand had grazed her waist and left her reeling. And the chaos sphere, his weight pinning her, her knee on his chest, the fusion of logic and instinct that had carried her to victory. It's effective, she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Combined with structure, it's formidable. I wouldn't have beaten you without it. High praise from a Valari, he said, chuckling. The sound was warm, low, and it stirred something in her chest she didn't want to examine too closely. You're welcome, by the way. Took a lot of bruises to get you there. You pushed me, she admitted, meeting his eyes. Forced me to rethink everything, strategy, control, even myself. I thank you. The words felt strange on her tongue, unguarded in a way Valari rarely allowed, but they were true. His grin softened, and he leaned closer, his shoulder pressing more firmly against hers. Anytime, Zara, you're too good to stay stuck in one gear. And he paused, his voice dropping, teasing but sincere. You're fun when you let loose. Her ears twitched, heat creeping up her face, and she shot him a look. I don't let loose, she said, her tone dry, but a smirk tugged at her lips despite herself. Uh-huh, he murmured, his breath brushing her cheek as he leaned in just a fraction more. Keep telling yourself that. I've seen you fight now. You've got chaos in you, and it's damn impressive. She turned away, sipping the coffee to hide the flush on her cheeks, but his words lingered. Chaos in her. She'd spent her life building walls of logic, precision, Valari discipline. Yet Mark had torn them down, piece by piece, and rebuilt something new. She wasn't just a strategist anymore. She was adaptable, unpredictable, alive in a way she hadn't been before. He shifted beside her, his hand brushing hers as he adjusted his cup, and her ears twitched again, the contact sending a faint shiver through her. She didn't move her hand away. "You're staying on the station?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "For now," he said, shrugging. "Got some jobs lined up, cargo runs, maybe some training gigs. Depends on what comes my way." He glanced at her, his grin returning. "Unless you've got a better offer." Her pulse quickened, and she met his gaze, searching those green eyes for a moment. There was a challenge there, a question, and something warmer she couldn't ignore. She set her cup down, standing to face the viewport at the far end of the hall. The stars stretched out beyond, endless and vast, a reminder of the galaxy she'd sworn to navigate with purpose. Mark followed, standing beside her, his presence steady at her side. "What about you?" he asked. "Back to Valari duty? More fights to win?" She tilted her head, her ears still as she considered. "I'll report my progress. The Chaos Sphere data will interest them, proof that adaptability matters as much as strategy." But after that, she trailed off, glancing at him. "I'm not sure." He stepped closer, his arm brushing hers again, and this time she felt the warmth of it fully. "Stick around," he said, his voice low, earnest. "You and me, we'd make one hell of a team. Shake up this galaxy a little." Her ears twitched, and she turned to face him, her violet eyes meeting his green ones. His grin was gone, replaced by something quieter, more serious, and her breath caught. She thought of their fights, the clash of logic and chaos, the way he'd pushed her to her limits and beyond. She thought of his laugh, his touch, the way he'd become more than an opponent. "Partners," she said, testing the word. "If you'll have me," he replied, holding out his hand. She stared at it, rough, scarred, human, and then took it, her grip firm. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and her ears twitched one last time as their hands lingered. "We'll see," she said, her smirk returning. "You'll have to keep up." He laughed, a sound that filled the hall, and squeezed her hand before letting go. Challenge accepted. They turned back to the viewport, standing side by side, the stars stretching out before them. The station hummed beneath their feet, a quiet promise of what lay ahead. Zara felt the weight of her victory settle into her. A Valari warrior reshaped by a human's chaos, stronger for it. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time, she didn't need to calculate it. The future was out there, vast and uncharted, and she'd face it with him. Logic and chaos, hand in hand.